everybody. Hope you guys had a nice break. We're back. I'm Edja, and this is Kyron, and we are back with our latest installment of our podcast series. And today we'll be talking about Martin Luther King Jr. Kyron, do you want to start us off? Give us maybe a little background or...
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think a good starting point would just be us kind of talking about, like, what do we know about MLK in terms of anything. So today's podcast is going to be centered around Martin Luther King Jr. With the upcoming holiday, of course, Martin Luther King Jr. Day. And if I look back as far as to like when I was educated in grade school about, the civil rights movement, specifically Martin Luther King Jr., it was almost akin to learning about like Jesus Christ as you learn about Christianity. Like, it really did seem as though the civil rights movement kind of begun, took place, and finished with him. And so I just remember always learning about it. Like, it started with the March on Washington in the 60s and ended with his assassination. And I couldn't tell you much more about him. I could tell you he had a dream. I could tell you he was, of course, like anti-segregation, but I couldn't tell you maybe like what his actual ideologies are beyond that. And so I think it's really interesting growing up, and like you learn more about him, you learn as your sense of US history in general grows, of course, your sense of that time period grows. And you learn about like all these other alternate names. But for a long time, if you asked me what a civil rights activist was, I probably would have been like Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, and that's it. Like, and that's kind of crazy to me. But I think now, as an older person in college and having done some of that work to educate myself and like seek that out, I would say that he's an activist. He's also, a preacher, a father, a husband, so many other different things. But I think my largest takeaway was that he was big on equality. And it wasn't necessarily just for, when we talk about race or even when we talk about just identity in general. He was really big on making sure people who were working got paid fairly. He was big on making sure that everybody was in like good condition. So equal rights, really, like beyond even just looking at civil rights or looking at like racial equality in this country. Equal rights was like his platform. And so I guess that's who he is to me, a champion of that.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it's like an important thing you bring up about what we learn about Martin Luther King Jr. in school, and Rosa Parks, like you said. And those are two figures that are definitely like the cornerstone of like the entire, it's like you said, the conversation sort of starts and ends with them. And like, that's what you're taught since a very young age. And like, I think that something for me that definitely stands out is the emphasis on like peaceful protest, and that sort of ideology or like conviction for like nonviolent protest. And that was important to like his movement at that time, like a lot of things that happened. But I think that when we like get into it and you like get a bit older and like you have a lot more in depth of an understanding of like what was going on and like what peaceful protest means, and like what, because on one hand, like we talk about peaceful protest and they're held up for this ideology of peaceful protest, and then later on maybe it's in a history textbook or maybe it's not, and then it's like you're finally shown like the really great violence that was enacted against these peaceful protesters, and like what does a peaceful protest mean when both sides are not peaceful. And so that's definitely something that I know really struck me as like I got older and learned more about it. And then it also just calls to mind like more recently, like with the Black Lives Matter movement and stuff like that, people like weaponizing Martin Luther King Jr.'s words against these protesters and saying like he would be like disappointed, and that this was like going against like, because like the protesters weren't peaceful enough. I just think that as a figure, he's like incredibly built up in our education history, and the way that like his words are used and his actions are used, I think is very interesting. We can get more into that. But yeah, for sure.
Definitely agree, and I see a lot of that. It's like almost he's almost a deity, almost like a myth, in a lot of ways. And it is a big thing, I think, when we look at like protesters today, or even protesters in the past, and you see how it's interesting how people will bring up his words and be like, Martin Luther King would have been so disappointed in these protests. Martin Luther King would never have wanted you guys doing this. And it's like, well, it's interesting for a lot of reasons, but one of them is just like, okay, even if Martin Luther King Jr. hated these protests, I think the idea that, again, that it starts and ends with him and his opinions and his thoughts is like, it's a dangerous thing, because we have now like almost somebody whose word is gospel. Again, like it's like almost examining Jesus Christ if you were a Christian. Like for Black people, Martin Luther King Jr. is almost like that person. And so it's very interesting when you see people whose rhetoric misaligns with that or doesn't necessarily line up with it, like a Malcolm X or like a Fred Hampton or like a lot of people, and kind of see how that gets compared and how their rhetorics are thrown out of the window using Martin Luther King Jr.'s, although they were also big activists of their times. So it's like, I kind of find that maybe because Martin Luther King Jr. is a more palatable figure, that he is the one who is more regaled in modern history after the fact, now that the victors have rewritten it. But yeah, I think there's a lot to be said for how that goes, and like kind of that softening of even his own messages when we look at like, again, peaceful protests. And you said like how there are peaceful protests but only one side is peaceful. And so I think he did have like a big part in what that kind of looks like today, or even how we think of protest and like the magnitude that we do it. And I mean, even that, the way that he had back then would be like, if you were being hosed down, still don't fight back. If you're being like attacked, still don't fight back. You know, nowadays we kind of see peaceful protest, and it's more of a version of like, it's peaceful until it's not, which is like, you know, it's sensical because that's how things work. But it's very interesting to see how not only have we veered away necessarily from, I guess, whatever I feel like Martin Luther King's would have thought was right, or would have thought was the right method, while still fighting, of course, against what I'm sure he would have considered to be unjust. But I think there is a lot of that, you know, like sacrificing the part of Martin Luther King Jr. that said like, these things are unjust, and amplifying the part of him that said, handle these things this way, you know, like taking part of his message without regarding the rest of it.
Yeah, and I think that like I haven't heard of this before, but I think you're bringing up like a really interesting parallel between like him and Jesus Christ, and like making him into that sort of figure. And I think like for me, it brings to mind people again who use the Bible, who use their religion, or who use like texts like that, or the like as a way to like perpetuate violence against people, or to perpetuate oppression or injustice. And I think that's really interesting. I definitely think that it's something that we've seen, and that, like you said, kind of comes with making Martin Luther King Jr. into a more palatable like figure, and not necessarily his whole figure or his whole ideology or his whole life. And even like you said, like the civil rights movement as like a whole entire in its entirety is like narrowed down to like him and Rosa Parks and peaceful protest. And all that it accomplished is also narrowed down to them. And like you mentioned like Fred Hampton and Malcolm X and like the Black Panther Party and like all of these different organizations that were also working like at the same time as Martin Luther King. And it was a movement. It was a whole like
Yeah.
period of time with so many people involved and so many different activists and organizations. And the fact that now we as in our education system, our history books, like media, like all of it kind of attributes it to him and only talks about him and this one specific branch of this whole entire movement because it's like you said, it's what serves kind of to perpetuate whatever it is that lots of people want to like it's the easiest thing to say is like, oh, it was entirely peaceful. These people did this. This was like they just wanted racial equality. They wanted to end segregation and they were entirely peaceful. And that was all that happened. And they achieved it by being entirely
Yeah.
peaceful. So
And
now when anyone does anything else, it's like, oh, but they did this by doing this. Like, therefore, you have to do that. And I think it lacks a lot of nuance. In addition, like you said, like to put him and to make it end with him also, like with his assassination, I think what you bring up brings up an important point of like feeling like they did it, like everything was fine and like they achieved everything they wanted and everything was fine.
yeah.
So I don't know if you want to talk more about that, but I think that's important as well.
No, I definitely think that when we look at not only the erasure of all those other figures that were so instrumental in that and are still like their teachings and their ideology is instrumental today, kind of erasing them from that era and erasing their work, not only like in order to simplify it, I guess, and to make it more of a footnote than a section of history, but also to serve that narrative that Martin Luther King Jr. was a pacifist, and when he stood in the street and got hosed down, everything was great, and he accomplished everything he wanted. So if you want to accomplish things, stand in the street and get hosed down, and just let it happen, and eventually everything will be better, like it was for him. I think it ignores so many other like ideologies that were at work at that time, and so many other people who are instrumental in making that work, and even the people who were behind Martin Luther King Jr., who maybe had conflicting ideologies, or even when he wasn't necessarily in line with his ideologies himself, and maybe practiced other actions that weren't necessarily the pacifism that we know him for today. And I think that even beyond that, when you get into like just making anybody that much larger than life or making anybody like a Christ-like figure, you get into so many things about like a person can never be perfect. A person can never be like so many different things. And I think for us to, look at him like that and to view any figure, any historical figure or political figure, especially as perfect or without flaw, is dangerous because everybody has flaws. Everybody has some flaw in their ideology. Nobody has it all figured out. Nobody's perfect. And so I think that it's very interesting to see like he's the one person I think I can think of, especially amongst Black men, who I think like society forces it down your throat that this is a perfect person. Like
Mhm.
this is exactly how you should be. Because he's the most manageable of I think those figures in terms of their ideology. And so I think that does have a large effect even on how we look at our politicians nowadays and our activists and our ideology nowadays, how pacifism is valued as I think such as like a virtue, when I don't think that it's necessarily a virtue or a vice. I think that in any situation, there are some situations that it makes sense to be a pacifist in, and then there are those which it makes sense to be active and aggressive in. And
Yeah.
so I think that it's the absolutism, I think, that's associated with Martin Luther King Jr. and like making him again like the alpha and the omega of civil rights, the alpha and the omega of activism, like the marquee for all these things. It kind of invalidates any other way to do it. And I don't think that that's necessarily healthy. But I think that and I think it also has a lot to do with our recollection of segregation. I think when you look at it as something that like started and ended, even if you look at it with something that started and ended with Martin Luther King and Malcolm X and Rosa Parks and whoever else in that self-contained little decade, it kind of like dampens the view that segregation didn't start in the 50s or the 60s, and it didn't really end in the 50s or the 60s either. It's reaches back as far as the 1600s, and its impact is felt as far as today. So I think that, yeah, it is a lot of rewriting history in an effort to simplify it and make it make more sense when it just doesn't make sense at all. It pretty much never will, but we should tell it how it happened.
Yeah, totally. And I think like you bring up a phrase that I think is important, and it's rewriting history. And it's something that we've talked about like in other podcasts and stuff a lot. And it's something we kind of touch on when we talk about these like important days that we come across throughout the year that have this sort of like, it's almost like folklore behind them, because it's not like an accurate, like when we talked about Thanksgiving or when we talk about Christmas or when we talk about Monday when we'll celebrate Martin Luther King Jr. It's like we have this whole story and background that's, like you've mentioned, not necessarily accurate, not necessarily like nuanced. It doesn't incorporate many other figures. It doesn't talk about multiple sides or like the reality of the situation. It's kind of like watered down. It's made palatable. Like these are all words we're using. And I think just like thinking about what that means exactly is like in history books that I had like in high school or whenever, or I don't know, like when we're talking about the civil rights movement, we are learning about lots of things, learning about Martin Luther King, learning about sit-ins and peaceful protests and stuff like that. And then oftentimes there's like one little paragraph that's like the Black Panther Party, and they're made out to be like militant and like anti-white, and like in this one little paragraph, and like that's all we talk about. And we talk about like the accomplishments of the civil rights movement with only, again, like Martin Luther King Jr. and stuff like that. And it's like that's a very tangible way, I think, to see how literally history is rewritten and how it is presented to us. And there's lots of other ways to talk about that in media and in books and wherever. But if just thinking back to every textbook you've been given, what does it contain and what's like the narrative that it's promoting? And I think that that's definitely an important thing to keep in mind as a high schooler, as someone being given textbooks that you're supposed to read and like taking courses that like you're supposed to do well in and whatever. Like it's off, like I think it took me a really long time to even just like think that a textbook could be something that was not
Yeah, not right.
like
Or
like
accurate.
objective and accurate, like because you're given, it's like you're young, you're given this like fat textbook that's like this is history, and history is like objective, and this is just what happened because it's history, and like these are the facts. And the it takes so long to like realize that the facts can be presented in so many ways, and that things can be written with so many biases. And how are you supposed to be told that when your history teachers are just like, here's your textbook, this is what happened? And so yeah, for anybody watching who maybe you're in high school or college or beyond or wherever, like think about what's being given to you and what's being presented as fact and history, and what history really is. Like it's a question that like didn't even cross my mind till college, like till classes that were like, what is it, like what are we talking about? I don't know, I think that's really interesting. I wonder if you've had experience with that as well.
I definitely agree. And I think that I would even say, like, I'm sure there's so much about it that I still don't know, or that a lot of things that I'm still ignorant on. Even if only because, like, the information is hard to access. It's not designed to be easy to access. It's not designed for you to know. Like, there are a lot of things that are not necessarily being actively kept from you, but that I don't think that you're intended to think about even, or
Yeah,
that
they're
you're
not
not
being
really
given to you.
to go seek this out. Like once they give you a textbook, you're pretty much expected to take that as fact. And you have to have some type of like outside interest or some type of other thing that like motivates you to go find it. And so for a lot of people, I would love to say like everybody should go educate themselves on this thing, and everybody should like make sure that they're aware of this. But realistically, if you're in 5th grade right now, what's going to trigger you later in life to go look at that? Or even if you're in high school right now and you've been taught something in a textbook, like what is that callback to go look at that? You have to be like informed that everything is not what it seems before you go searching for like the real picture, I think.
Yeah.
Like if you don't know you're in an illusion, there's no seeking out what it really is. And so I think that for a long time, like I never noticed like there were so many different things because there are so many, I think, layers to it. And even finding that out, like I think growing up, a lot of people don't notice that there's an other, like there's the default and there's the other. And so history, I think, is told from the standpoint of whatever the default is at the time. And of course, like our default in this country is straight white men. And so you read these textbooks and you watch My Friend Martin, and you never once like think like this isn't from my perspective, because I'm just 10 years old sitting in a classroom just watching this. Like I don't really care what color the person who wrote this is. I'm thinking that we're all the same. And so perspective, like you just don't have it to know. And I
Yeah.
think that once you do get it, you can begin to ask these questions like that doesn't make sense, or maybe that's not how it really went down, or maybe I should go look at another source for some information on this topic that I'm interested in. But I just, as a kid, it never happened for me. And it wasn't until I read the autobiography of Malcolm X, and it was just something I did one off for I think an 8th grade class. And I was so shocked because it was just so like such a rich book and so many things happened in it. And I was just like, how is this not a person that there are movies about? How have I not seen like this person's like book? Like, why am I not hearing about him? Like, because he just seemed so much more like of a figure that in any other version of history would have been deified over MLK, if only for the excitement and the brandability of it. Like when we look back into history, we have 1,000 Cleopatra movies, 1,000 anything where the person is considered interesting. But I think when we look at civil rights, we end up with a lot of our main figures tend to be, for whatever reason it is, a lot less aggressive or a lot less dynamic, so to speak, than some of their white counterparts. We look at a lot of like Paul Revere or something like that, or George Washington, and all the depictions that you'll see of them are them standing up strong in a really like bold and like empowered position. And then you look at the civil rights era and it's like Rosa Parks didn't get off the bus and MLK let people hose him down in the street and went to jail for his beliefs. And so what you kind of get, I think, out of that as a message is like, it really does, I think, tell you like when white people want something, they can go take it. When Black people want something, they need to persevere through and like fight through
And
a
endure. Like,
strategic way not to offend anybody along the process. And I just don't think that we look at any other group in history and we see them like that. And we say like, oh yeah, the way that they should get out of their oppression is by being pacifist. Like we don't look at the American Revolution and say that. We don't look at the French Revolution and say that. We look at that and we like revere that they were brave and bold enough to stand up and take whatever they thought was theirs. But when we look at, I think, figures who did that when it comes to civil rights, and it's not only just the civil rights movement, I think it's even when we look at any other thing that I think, again, deviates from that default, then the story gets different and the narrative changes. So I think that's definitely interesting. But if I was to say like, maybe what I take away from MLK, knowing these things now and kind of having had the opportunity and the insight to go look into it more, is not necessarily that pacifism is how you can achieve things, but that if you want something or if you believe in something, then there's not only an obvious way to get it. There can be creative ways to achieve. There can be creative ways to enforce one's ideology that don't involve aggression and that don't involve necessarily actively fighting in the way of an aggressor. But I do think, yeah, it's definitely interesting to see how and why that story changes when we look at different groups, and how, even though, like, of course, Martin Luther King Jr. was a great man and is a great role model for a lot of people, why he is the one that gets fed to specific people directly.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, thank you for all of that. Yeah, I think, like, to close us out, for me personally, like, something that I feel like I would like to, like, challenge myself to do, or, like, a way that I feel like would celebrate Martin Luther King Jr. and his time and his life is, for me, I think I would like to go push myself to learn more about him and his works that maybe, like, are not so broadly pushed to us, like, learn more about just beyond the civil rights movement, what he wanted and what he wanted to, like, continue fighting for past his, like, successes, and I think also to think about all of the other leaders that we've mentioned, like Fred Hampton and Malcolm X and Rosa Parks and all of the other parties and organizations and people who were, like, such a big part of this. I think because it's something we're not necessarily given on a yearly basis, or, like, in our classes or whatever, I think it's something that, for me, I'm gonna push myself to seek it out. I know there are, like, lots of resources online and stuff like that, even though it's like it's not necessarily something that you can, like, demand of people because it's, like, a difficult thing that's not being given to us, but I think for me personally, I'll be pushing myself to do that. I would encourage everyone else to just think critically about what information you're being given, and if you have the time and means, definitely go out and try to find more information for yourself.
I definitely agree. I think I would have a similar call to action. I would just encourage anybody who's listening to this, or anybody who's in high school right now, or even beyond or before, to always just to always look at history from more than one perspective, and to always know that, like, if you're reading a textbook, if you're doing something in school for a curriculum, that's one perspective of it, that's one way to look at things. But history, it's things that happened. It's not necessarily a matter of one person's fact. And so that's not to say that every textbook is wrong, or that every article you'll read online is right. But it is to say that if you're getting all your history from Holt and McDougall or whoever, then you're only hearing one person's opinion of it. You're only hearing one person's perspective of it. You're only hearing one person's view of all that. And it can't be the full thing.
All right, and we will see you guys next time.